glad you could all join us today after 560 days since our last Tuesday morning fellowship meeting at Spellman Hall. Whether you're with us in person or by remote and Zoom, it's great to have so many of us back in the fold, and even though several of our loyal members have passed on. We're pleased to have our pastor, Don Lincoln, kick off our fall sessions. After this, we will have 13 more meetings with a diversity of speakers and a field trip in mid-October, a train ride on the Westchester Railroad, which you can still sign up for with Dave Walker. Pastor Lincoln has honored us with his presence many times before. The one talk I especially fond of was his when he shared his secrets on fly fishing and his homage to one of my favorite novels and movies, Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. Today, he's going to give us a retrospective on his 21 years as Westminster's lead minister. It seems like only yesterday that he gave his first sermon in August 2000. And a parishioner came up to him afterwards and remarked, "Well, you're certainly not Bob Young." He knew then it wouldn't be easy to succeed someone so beloved. But he has done it with his own personality, style, and Christian charity. And as Pastor Emeritus Young told Don Lincoln, in another 20 years, someone will come up to you, to the next head minister, and say, "Well, you're certainly not Don Lincoln." Thanks for joining us once more, Pastor Lincoln, and if you could lead us in prayer to begin with.
I'll be glad to pray. Let's pray. Everybody hear me on the good?
Yes.
Let's pray. Holy God, we give you thanks for the beauty of this morning, the beauty of a host of recent mornings, the fresh, crisp air, and the bright sun, the blue sky, reminders that your presence is constantly with us. Bless our time today as we reflect, as we ponder, and may we continue to be faithful and fruitful for your service, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
So I am honored to be here. So a retrospective on 21 years. So I'm assuming you're ready. You've got food and sleeping bags because we'll be here a while. I mean, it's going to take some time. Craig had suggested, maybe some funny stories, maybe some poignant or even sad stories, uplifting stories, tips for the incoming pastor, and I've followed to some degree his encouragement. It was a good adventure. I won't give too many tips to the new pastor. I'll save those to whenever he or she arrives, and I have a chance to tell them where all the landmines are, and who they should get to know right away. People they can talk to, and feel free to say, "What in the world am I doing now?" So anyway, but this is going to be kind of a sort of a shotgun scatter shot about ministry in 21 years, and I actually, one of my most memorable events I talked about in a sermon, not to get myself in the camera a little more there so I can see these folks. A couple weeks ago, I talked about 9/11, which was the day after the anniversary of the 20 years, and I mentioned that Linda and I were in Italy, and we were checking in at the MP station in an army base in Vicenza, Italy. We were going to spend 9 days with Ed Brandt, Chaplain Brandt, exploring Italy, and just had this great, and the second plane hit the World Trade Centers as we were checking in, and it wreaked some havoc on our trip. Ultimately, we still got to see Italy, and people were incredibly gracious and thoughtful to us as they realized we were Americans. Of course, we couldn't fly home right away, and Wes Smith, who was a beloved pastor at the time, was sort of left in charge because Ann Dickey, the other pastor, the primary associate pastor, had flown to a wedding out in the Midwest, Kansas or Nebraska or somewhere out there, and she was actually in the air when they grounded planes. And I was in Italy, and poor Wes was a part-time pastor. He was from the Assemblies of God church, so didn't know all things Presbyterian completely thoroughly. But Wes planned a service on that Friday night, I think, after the towers went down, and he took the American flag into the sanctuary, which he had no clue was something that had been decided many years before. That was not where it belonged. It was fine to have in the building and in the hallway, but in the religious sacred space, we weren't going to have symbols of nationalism. And so, of course, when Wes put it in there, and Ann and I got back, Ann jumped all over that and said, how are we going to get it back out of here now? And anyway, and he also, they took an offering that evening and gave it to the Red Cross without asking Sessions permission, which is like, if there's one thing you always have to ask permission about, is where you're going to send an offering if it's a special offering. And anyway, it was an adventure. The other thing was, there was a staff member, and I don't want to say who, but there was a staff member who chastised me for not getting back home, for not getting back to Westminster to care for the flock. And I said, well, the first flight home was actually 9 days later. It was the first flight that left Venice, Venice, Italy, which is where we had flown into and out of. It was the first flight. That was our flight, and fortunately, they we kept our seats. And she said, well, you should have figured out how to get home. And I thought, it's not like I'm going to charter a plane, land in Canada, canoe down the St. Lawrence, and get, it was, you should be here. And I said, what could I do? It was a very, Linda and I arrived, and we had flown out of JFK, and we got the shuttle out to our car and found it covered in dust. And, as for everybody, it was an incredibly terrifying and sad and poignant and memorable time but for me. But probably my first real memory after the sermon comment that Craig mentioned was the last Sunday of August, and Linda and I were headed to North Carolina. We had a trip on the books for the Outer Banks for some time with family, and when we had scheduled that, had no clue that I would be changing churches and whatever. And so it was a week's vacation, and last Sunday in August, right after church, we, Linda headed out to get in her car and to head home, and I would make my way home shortly thereafter. And Rick, you may remember what happened that day. Linda had a little BMW convertible, and she was in the back parking lot. It wasn't the parking lot wasn't big then. It was just the little side section here, and the accelerator on Linda's little BMW stuck when she put it in gear. And
wow,
there was a black Buick. Was it a Park Avenue? Rick, or was it?
No, it was, I forget.
But anyway, it was Rick's
It was a small one.
friends, there, and Linda plowed into that, and that car then got pushed into Jerry Lean's car. Jerry sings in the choir, tall guy. He's part of his wife is Mel. She's one of the McFalls clan. So that, Linda took out some really significant people. The fourth Sunday I was here, and I heard this, and I came out, and she was just mortified. The new pastor's wife is wrecking vehicles in the parking lot, and then Rick and Frank came walking out of church to see what the commotion was. And she saw that it was her beautiful, beautiful, shiny black Buick, which I think had just been returned from the shop.
Yes,
Rick?
yes.
after some body work or you know, and she was like, I could see the look on her face. And then she found out it was the new pastor's wife. And she put just a lovely charitable grin on her face and just pretended not to be, maybe she wasn't upset, but the two of them were as gracious as could be. How do you yell at the new pastor's wife in the church parking lot? So anyway, it was an adventure. Early on, I learned, well, I didn't really realize how many permutations of sound systems we would go through in the sanctuary. There are still speakers in the sanctuary in the ceiling, and they're way up high by the lights on the ceiling, the very first system, and you could not understand anybody who said anything in that space. They had changed that. They put in some speakers, and part of what the problem was the folks who were talking about the sanctuary and its design said, we don't want to have speakers anywhere where you can see them. And one of the problems is when they're nowhere you can see them, they typically also can't be heard from. But I got there and there was a pretty complicated sound system, these Bose array speakers on the sides, right up by the front corners of the sanctuary. But the sound booth where the sound operators worked the controls was actually in the closet where the current camera monitors are for our live stream cameras, up in the front corner. They were in the closet with the door closed, couldn't hear anything in the sanctuary. So had no clue if there was feedback. You couldn't wave at them and say, you know, can't hear anything. So that was one of the first adventures for me in renovations in this incredibly beautiful new building was, you know, can we do some work with the sound system? One of many renovations. The chancel got redesigned. I'll say a little more about the parking lot got expanded, but we had a bell room. Anybody remember the bell room over on the far hallway? It's where the library is now. Anybody know where the library was? Yeah, it was right down the with this gathering space where there's coffee and stuff. That was the library. We had a bell room that got used for 2 hours on Wednesday nights. And that was it. And we found ourselves in need of space, and the bells are back in here now, a room that was not used much at all, and then we converted the library. But anyway, there was lots of renovations over the years. Another thing that happened in my first year, and this was, does anybody know the name Tim Lake? Anybody remember Tim Lake? Anybody? Channel 10? Tim Lake was one of the newscasters on Channel 10. And some of you may remember, but PennDOT had developed a plan for the widening of 202. Dave remembers that. You would of course remember this. And the plan came, you know, where the bypass comes in and meets up with Street and heads down this way. Well, the plan was for that curve to come out and go right through Stetson Middle School, right through Westminster, and maybe take out a little bit of the brand new Mercedes dealership as well, and curve down completely and cut off all of this sort of crazy, you know, congestion to 926 and you know, and people went nuts. I learned in some conversations that the reality was that PennDOT had been asked to do the, you know, what the widening would look like on 202. And so I think they put out the worst possible scenario you could have, so that everybody would freak out about it and they could go back to what their original plan is, which we built according to. We've got enough of a buffer along our eastern edge to make sure we can get a couple more lanes on 202 when, if ever, it gets widened. But people were calling me. Tim Lake came out and interviewed me because he wanted to know this new pastor, this beautiful church. It was only built a few years ago. And can you imagine? And of course, I just played it. You know, we have a memorial garden with members interred in it. Can you imagine having to move those? And of course, nobody was thinking that we actually had a memorial garden in the borough, which was lovingly disinterred and brought here. But nevertheless, it seemed prudent to talk about how challenging it was going to be for the community, for the congregation to do with. All along, pretty certain that it was not going to happen. Members were calling me. But the funny thing is there were, well, I'll just say the office staff, who all happened to be female, had no interest in what I was saying about the interview. But if you recall Tim Lake, he is a very good looking man. I said, Don, couldn't you come in the building with him and do the interview inside instead of outside looking at the facility? They were all excited having Tim Lake in the building. Another early one, I don't know for anybody who was here in the early days, but we somehow Westminster did combine Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday. And we have pancakes and sausage on Ash Wednesday. You're supposed to have that on Shrove Tuesday, Fat Tuesday, and then you do Ash Wednesday. But this church draws from a large area. It's pretty hard to get people a couple nights, 2 nights in a row to come in. So anyway, we did a combo that existed before me, and it was in here in Spellman Hall, and pancakes and sausage, and then the service of worship took place at the tables, and we had some little wooden things that put the communion cups in, and people would be like taking your plates and stuff, and so it was kind of but the concern is if we dismiss them from dinner, they won't go into the sanctuary. They'll just go out the front door and head to the parking lot. So that we got a captive audience. Let's keep them here and there were no ashes being done, which is no surprise because most Presbyterian churches weren't in the practice of that. I never grew up with the ashes. So I had experienced, what we did at Westminster, and subsequent Ash Wednesday, I suggested to my colleagues, Ann Dickey and Wes Smith, I said, you know what, I'd love to do ashes. And they you could see the blood drain out of their face. It's just, it's not Presbyterian. It's not. Neither one of them had ever done anything like that was way too Catholic. Not that our Catholic cousins aren't cousins. I mean, anyway, but I said, look, we'll do the service in here, and I'll let folks know I'm going to be down in the chapel. And anybody who would like to come, we'll just impose ashes, and it will be no big deal. Nobody's going to be stuck here. I'm not going to guard the door with ashes, and you can't leave until I get you. So anyway, I said, we announced it, and Pastor Don will be down in the chapel, and some people went up, but 87 people lined up to receive ashes, lined up all the way down this hallway. And the last 2 in the line were Wes Smith and Ann Dickey. And they walked forward and said, we just never imagined that this would be this meaningful to this many people. And I said, well, I've learned quickly that probably 35% of this congregation is former Roman Catholic, and it was meaningful for them, and it's become. And we did drive-by ashes. A couple. Some of you may remember that. I was out on 202 with a sign. Drive-by ashes, and we had a church member who came in at 7:00. Was the first one, and then there was a woman from St. Agnes who came in tears, and she was handing us money. She says, because of my work, I have never been able to have ashes. She was just weeping. Anyway, so that's Ash Wednesday. I better get moving here. I'll probably some of the most poignant and sad and challenging things have been related to, specific funerals, memorial services, deaths. And we had in my tenure here, 3 suicides in the congregation. All 3 of them by handgun. Those guns were all bought either the day of or the day before individuals killed themselves. 22-year-old, 47-year-old, and Betty was 80, I think 83 years old, and her son, who also committed suicide along with her, was in his 50s. It's not funny, but I've always said, you can buy a gun today and use it without any problem. But if you get a marriage license today, it is a 48-hour waiting period before it can be used. I'm trying to mean marriage is more dangerous. Well, maybe it is. That's. But some of that. Alex Gatson was the young man who was wrestling with addictions and deep depression, and a lovely kid and a lovely family, and that was one of the most difficult services we've done. And Alex did amazing stuff in the life of this church. Another one was a gentleman, John Timms, and not sure what all caused that, but very tragic in his 40s. Betty Schelt was just a lovely older woman who had battled with depression her life, throughout her life, on and on. But her son in his 50s who had debilitating depression, institutionalized at times, and I don't know exactly what happened, but my guess is that he let her know that he was going to take his life, which he had attempted numerous times, and I think she just decided to join him. And one of the gifts for me was about 12 years of emails from Betty, repartee back and forth with her pastor. Lovely. Occasionally she would chew me out for something I said in a sermon, but the overwhelming majority was just reflections of her faith and her joy in the life of this church. And one of the gifts for me was having that correspondence with Betty to call upon and celebrate her life and her faith. But those were difficult times. Probably one of the most memorable events I had at a cemetery was, what's the cemetery on Route 1 near the Wawa? Edgewood Green, Edge Green, something, and out there on Route 1, headed toward, down toward Granite Run. Yeah, right, exactly. So anyway, it's kind of a wide, sweeping cemetery, a lot of flat land. It was 16 degrees, and there was about 4 inches of snow on the ground, but it had thawed and frozen, and so it was like a hard crust, and walking on it, you could kind of walk, but it was slick, and then your foot would actually break through, and it was just, getting out to and it was blowing, I want to say 25 knots. But it was a gravesite, and they had gotten it open, and it must have had some, incredible, turbocharged backhoe, and we're out there, and it was, we had a color guard there, and of course, they usually do last, and so the pastor's first, and I'm pretty efficient and quick at a gravesite. I'm not, we've already had a service, so I don't need to, retell, everything I've said at a service. So, but the bugler was there, Army bugler, young woman, And I finished up, and I turned to her, and she pulled her mouthpiece out of her pocket. So she is smart. It was plastic, not metal. She got it up to her lips and could not, her cheeks were so tight, she couldn't pucker enough to make a buzz, could not get that sound out for anything. And we stood there. Eventually, she got, we were working on enough, and eventually got taps out. But it was, I'll forget, and I thought, boy, I marched in the marching band, and I remember playing in cold weather, but to stand there to grade, I had to be determined. I got to play taps for this guy before we leave, and it better happen soon. Here's another, just, we have a memorial garden here at Westminster. I don't know who started that, but it obviously it was during my predecessor's tenure, Bob Young's tenure, and it's just a lovely gift to folks who want to take advantage of that. And we've buried a lot of folks, and we've expanded. We now have this ossuary, but my two favorite burial containers. One was Jacob Lebo, and we had a family, the Lebo family, Peter and Betsy and Jacob, and I can't remember his brother's name because he died before I got here. But Jacob and his brother both had muscular dystrophy, and they didn't discover it. The older one had it, until the second one was born, and the older one died in his teens, and Jacob was a young man in a pretty incapacitated in a wheelchair, but just an amazing kid. Lovely. And between the death of the sons, Betsy Lebo died of breast cancer. And he watched this family continue to exercise their faith, and Peter was just an amazing father and husband and member of the life of the congregation. But Jacob knew his death was coming, and so he told his dad what he wanted his ashes to be in. He loved model cars, building model cars, and he could no longer do it. Didn't have the dexterity, but he had one of his favorite model cars. He still had the box. He said, "Dad, put me in there." And I remember that sitting up in the front of the sanctuary at the celebration of his life, and he had touched so many lives. Great, just amazing, great kid, just sweet and positive and upbeat to the last day. And putting that model car box in the memorial garden out there, and sort of celebrating who Jacob was and what a gift he was to this congregation. The other one was a guy named Jack Cordy. Jack was, I think, 96 when he died. Jack sang in the choir until probably, I think until he was 93 or 94. He was a tenor. Some of you in here know Jack, knew Jack. Jack was a hump pilot, World War II, flying over the Himalayas. I remember Jack telling one story. He was hauling, it was a cargo plane, and he was hauling a collection of Chinese soldiers and donkeys, and they were going, flying a hump was challenging because of the heights and they were icing up and beginning to bog down. And Jack called one of the guys up front. He says, "I don't care who, donkeys or the Chinese, but you got to throw somebody off of this plane, or we are not going to make it." Jack was a character, and Jack let me know what he was going to be. He was known by his great-grandchildren, because he had great-grandchildren, as the Cookie Monster. You visited Jack, you got cookies. So the grandchildren, great-grandchildren went to one of those ceramics places where you can get a ceramic thing and put the glaze on it and paint it and fire it. Cookie jar. The grandchildren made a cookie jar for Grandpa Jack, and that's in the memorial garden there. And it was one of those just lovely little moments of life, and death and the joy that Jack had been. I could more stories, and I could begin to tell about celebrating lives, including, you know, spouses of some of you in here, and it's probably, you know, and I know most pastors will say it's probably one of the favorite parts of our job. It is such a sacred time to be with people. I would rather do 10 funerals than one wedding. And part of that's because weddings have become such a production. You never know what the mother of the bride is going to be like, but it's usually, you know, a force to be reckoned with. And nobody wants to be there. Nobody's listening to what you say. The bride and groom are here. You work on crafting this personal thing, and they're, you know, most of the time they're just, you know, staring gaga at each other. Everybody's looking at their watch, and, you know, and it's, you know, I don't do a service a long, you know, we're not doing a mass. It's, you know, it's kind of like 22 minutes. It's, you know, but they're ready to go party. Funerals and memorial services are a blessing, but I'll tell you one of my favorite wedding stories. And Ida Verno, who's still with us, and Ralph, who was a faithful part of this gang for many, many years. Ida was the wedding coordinator. And we had a rehearsal, and these were non-members, and Friday night rehearsal, and the groom never showed up. They just didn't show up, and these folks were in their 40s. He was, you know, like 47. She was right at 40. And they were horse folks. He was a horse trainer. And anyway, so we, and poor Ida Verno was just beside herself, Don, what are we going to do? You know, and I said, well, I will call her in the morning, but I can't imagine we're going to have a wedding. You know, and so I called her in the morning, and I said, I'm just checking for sure. I'm assuming we're not. So, oh no, we're having a wedding. He will be there. And I said, well, what's it? You know, and she said, well, he was from Ireland. He lived in the States for 15 years, but all of his buddies had flown over on Thursday night, and there were like 10 of them, and they took him out Friday morning and started drinking, and, you know, just drank themselves right through the rest of the day and into the evening and overnight. Well, so she said, we're having a wedding. Okay. And Ida was, now she didn't know what to think. So they all show up. It's the groom and 6 groomsmen, and they're all, and I mean, you can't make this stuff up. They're in green, of course, green crushed velvet tuxedos. And this isn't 1977. This is like, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And they're in the parlor, all sitting in there, sweating profusely, just red as beets. I mean, it was just, you know, and he was apologizing, and, oh, Pastor, oh, Father, it's Father, oh, Father, you know, and they're dropping a certain word that just kind of just tends to roll off the tongue in good Irish brogue, and Ida is like, she doesn't know what's going to happen, and, you know, Don, and I said, it's, you know, so the bride came 45 minutes late, I think, just to spite him. And I found out from the photographer, who was a very good friend of the bride, that she happened to be pregnant and wanted their child to have that father's name and to know who the father was. And she said, who knows whether we'll last a month, but by golly, we're going to be married. And I wish she had told me that. I wouldn't have sweat so many bullets, and poor Ida, and then Ida just rolled with it, and she was just gracious, and she got those guys lined up and got them in order and kept moving them around. It was like a sheepdog with a bunch of wayward sheep trying to get those guys. And they came down, and none of them fell over in the middle of the service. And we got through it, and he said, "I do," and they did, and oh, Ida would still. I'm sure she still remembers that. I think there were a lot of amazing gifts to the life of this church and my ministry over the years, but Ralph Verno was one of them. And when we went to 3 services on Sunday morning and found ourselves with 25 minutes between our 8:30 and 9:45 service, we were in 2 services during the year when I got here and only 1 service in the summer. And ultimately, we've had so many service changes that I think we've changed worship schedule 13 times in my 21 years of ministry. But when we went to 25 minutes between those 2 services and the choir singing at 8:30 and 9:45, and this was 15, 16 years ago when attendance tended to be more like people came 3 out of 4 Sundays instead of 1 out of 8. And it's just the patterns as life has gotten busier and things. Ralph had been a member of the fire police in Westchester for Lord knows how many years, and just took it upon himself to begin directing traffic out at our driveway. And every Sunday would he'd be at 8:30 service and he'd leave during the last hymn or whatever, and he would go out and direct traffic because we were backed up onto 202, which thankfully traffic on Sunday isn't like Friday at rush hour, but it's still, you come over that hill and the trucks come over that hill doing 60 and there are cars sticking out on 202, which of course wouldn't happen if they'd moved 202 to Stetson and taken the church out along the way. Anyway. And for years and years and years, Ralph just faithfully, I never saw it because I was always running around in the building, but Ralph, and how many of you, I'm sure, waved to Ralph, got directed by him, and it was only just a few years ago where Ralph felt like, it was time. And at that point, we hired a police officer to do that, which also gave some people a sense of confidence because it was also a time when there had been a fair number of shootings in churches, mass shootings, and so we were glad to have a police officer on the premises. But Ralph was one great gift. Another really, I better start wrapping this up soon. Another really memorable gift, and we were in trouble. And I know Bob Young will tell you that they thought, when they built this building and built 225 parking spaces, they'd gotten to heaven because they had 4 parking spaces in the borough. I mean, that was it. I mean, you could park on the street. Eventually, the parking garage came up, but that was parking. And heaven forbid if the pastor got there a little late, and there was actually a pastor's parking space, but 225 parking spaces didn't cut it. At Westminster, we began to grow. And part of that was because along with, all the other stuff that's going on, we'd have families of 4 with 3 cars here. Because dad would drive, to come and sing in the choir, and then mom would come with one of the other kids, and then the teenager who wanted to come last minute would come to, so you get one house, you think, oh, it's there would be one car for every, 4 or 5 people, and we, that just wasn't reality. So we made a plan. 2004, my 4th year here, 10 years after the building was built, to expand the parking lot. That whole back section that runs east to west was an expansion, an addition to the original parking lot. Just went down the arm, just past the dumpsters, and then down that arm to where the choir typically parks, if you know that, and that back section was non-existent. And it was going to cost a lot of money. And you may not know it, but that back section was actually down at the eastern end, about I don't know, maybe a 20-foot berm downhill. Well, I'm going to get something to wet me here. We had a plan, architect and design, civil engineers and everything, and in order to make it a level parking lot and not have a ramp going up, which just was, we're thinking, oh man, it's gonna go. We were going to have to put fill in, and we're talking fill. I mean, beyond imagining. As God would have it, Wellington, the retirement community outside Hershey's Mill, Ed McFalls, member of the church, very involved with Hershey's Mill. He's been sort of in the management of that property for his career. Wellington was being built, and the whole basement foundation was being dug out. And it was a lot of serpentine rock and heavy fill, and they needed to get rid of it. And it was going to cost a lot of money to get rid of it. A guy named John Shavito, another sad story in that family. Nick Shavito was one of the young adults we lost to an opioid overdose. But John Shavito owns a very significant paving concrete company. He offered his trucks. And so John Shavito's trucks, for free, trucked all the fill from Wellington, and they got rid of their stuff, and we got it, and then and it had, they would put 6 inches of rock down, and then they would roll it, because you got to pack it down, and it was a massive undertaking, and Lord knows how many hundreds of thousands of dollars were cut off of that project, and it gave us that packed parking lot, which thankfully is, held us through Christmases and Easters. I'm guessing I'm not going to see another Christmas or Easter quite like the ones I've seen in my 21 years, and I'm a little sad about that, but I'm hopeful that we'll get a few folks Christmas Eve, I'm guessing. Anyway, it was a huge gift, and it was amazing to see what happened. Oh, quickly, a couple more things. The Dillertown adventure, we took over a church. The pastor of the Dillertown church, which is just up kind of back behind the Dillertown Inn, if you don't know it, pastor there was a very small congregation, and they had to close. They had one member who contributed about 40% of their budget, and he moved, retired, and they said, we're not going to survive. And I had been friends with this pastor, charismatic guy, and just a lovely man, but very tiny congregation. Long story short, we took over that church, we closed it, we had sort of a burial service for it, and spent 6 months renovating it, and planted a satellite campus there. Tony Sundermeyer became the lead pastor there. He had been here 3 years as the youth pastor, and he was ready to move, finish with youth ministry. Fabulous guy, tremendous preacher. And that became an opportunity for Tony to preach weekly, to develop his skills, hone his skills. And since then, Tony's been pastor of 2 very significant churches in the Presbyterian Church. And so it was a gift to him and a gift to us. we ultimately ended up closing that shop. Tony was leaving, and we spent some money fixing it up, but we sold the property for $850,000, tithed that to the presbytery, and the remainder of it went against the debt on the land that we purchased adjacent to us. We also gave the preschool in that church to Bethlehem United Methodist back in,
Thornberry Township.
Thornberry Township. Thanks, Rob. They were hoping to build connections with families, and a lot of the families from the preschool actually came from the developments right behind the Wawa by the Giant off of 202, and it was like intact. We handed them like probably 30 households with young children, and all the equipment, all the infrastructure for the preschool from Dilworthtown. That was that. Tony Sundermeyer reminds me of one thing. It was a real experience having a husband and wife on staff. Tony's wife, Katie, was a minister as well. And I learned early on that I really had to, Katie had the habit of being more wifely than staff colleague. And I'll never forget one staff meeting, we were sitting there and Katie, Tony, stop picking your nose. I said, okay, Katie, if you get to do that, then we get to do that. If we get to talk, if you can talk to him that way, or you can talk to, we're all going to start talking like spouses, and that shut it down pretty quickly. Poor Tony. They've had a great run, and he's still a very, very dear friend. When we were fixing that Dilworthtown church, we were renovating some things, and I was actually on my hands and knees doing some baseboards in the old chapel. And there was a very steep ledge above that, about 4 feet up. And Jeff Nagorny, anybody remember Jeff Nagorny? Yeah, Jeff was an elder in this church. He ultimately became ordained as a pastor. Jeff was on top of that ledge, and the ledge was about maybe 20 inches deep, and he was cleaning the stained glass windows above me. I was on all fours down, the place that was in really, and I was cleaning baseboards with a heavy duty cleaner on all fours. And Jeff Nagorny, and Jeff's a little bigger than me, a little more robust, fell on me, landed right here, and my wrist has never been the same since. I'm like, but that was one of, it's battle wounds for doing ministry. They come along the way. Things happen. I've had my own missteps. There's a guy named Bob Miller who ushers. He and his wife Marion sit back in this back right by the sound booth, and they go to Arizona for a chunk of the year. But he was ushering, and when the ushers come forward with the offering plates, that which I don't know, like it feels like it's been a century since we did that. But the ushers come forward, stand at the steps, and the pastors come to get the plates and collect them and go up and put them on the table, and so that everybody can see them, but nobody can get to them either because they're plain view until the trustees can get them. I love that reasoning, but I had brand new leather soled shoes on, and I got to that step, and I could not have been more smooth skating down those steps than if it had been a single polished piece of aluminum plank. I mean, really, right across the edge. Bob didn't miss a beat, reached out his arm and literally caught me under my shoulder, probably under the other shoulder, and didn't spill a thing out of his offering plate. And I honestly, it was a, you got a robe on and you can't, and I still think who knows what I could have broken then. But from that point on, every time Bob came up with the offering plates, always got a hand out, just like he's ready for him. And thanks be to God. I haven't dropped any babies, but they're getting to a point where shoulder goes bad. Yeah, it's time. I'm going to quit and you can ask questions. But one thing some of you may have noticed, and I will tell my colleague and whoever comes, you can do whatever you want, but I've never used the senior pastor title here. I use lead pastor if I need to talk about it. And that's just my personal preference. And part of that's because I'm just not about titles. And people notice, colleagues most specifically, when I introduce myself in worship, I'm Don Lincoln. Do you know what I say? One of the pastors here. And that has been like gold to my colleagues, because they know it's not, it's not a personality cult. It's, I'm not, bigger than life, and they're all peons doing service to me. I have colleagues who, that's the first thing out of my mouth, senior pastor. It's just not been my practice. And it has meant a lot to me, because it's been a way for me to affirm I'm part of a team, and also to be able to say, I'm not one among unequals, and I mean, I know my job, and I know the buck stops here, and I know I'm the head of staff, and I have no problem doing or being that, but sometimes heads of staff are such huge personalities that they're really difficult to follow. Bob Young is an incredibly humble man and faithful. And it wasn't about Bob Young, it was about the gospel and about the ministry of the church. And it made it so easy to follow him. Some heads of staff, like suck all the air out of the building when they walk in, and trying to follow in their footsteps is impossible. And sometimes churches go through multiple, they call new pastors who end up being interims, even though they didn't plan on it. But that was one of the gifts of following Bob Young, was it was not like that at all. I mean, just this humble man who still, if you saw his stewardship video a couple of weeks ago, still has it. I mean, just great humor. But so that's been of a collection of things I'll talk to my successor about the climate that you create, with colleagues in the life of a congregation. And the other thing, most of it, now I haven't done this during COVID because I haven't needed to, but most people learned at some point what kind of car I drive. I have a white Audi A4, because they learn where I park. When we needed parking, I parked in the far southeast corner of the parking lot. I have colleagues who have senior pastor parking, by the door. By God, don't you park in the your car will be towed if it's like downtown Philly. The towing company will come get you. But number one, I need the exercise. But number two, why do I need to take up a spot right next to the door all morning long when there are others, who might really be able to utilize that, to their own advantage, who need to be close. And that, that to me and my colleagues are the same way, and I didn't tell them, but eventually over the years, they all began to bark out in the back lot. And I've been so blessed to be here. I mean, it's just been an amazing run. And I'm looking forward to how this last year goes, and hoping to see, before a year in, a good crowd in the sanctuary. And I'm very excited to see who gets to follow in my footsteps. And this congregation had 4 heads of staff in the 20th century. That's amazing. And I'm hoping that I'm the first of that same kind of consistent tenure in the life of this church. And I've been privileged to be here. That's enough.
still have the same musicians here?
The same musicians, yes. Bob and Glenn in the traditional service, yeah, they're still here.
Good.
Bob and Glenn are still here, and we're hoping to get a choir back together at some point. They're actually going to rehearse this Sunday with masks and distanced. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Chuck.
I remember the first time we came here and you introduced yourself as one of the pastors. I never forgot that. And when I heard that choir sing, that's what I was looking for in a church. I joined the choir that day. First to come here.
Join the choir your first day.
First day.
I love it. Yeah, it's, as someone who has a music degree and grew up with great music, that's just, this congregation it's got, in a variety of music, but the finest music program in the region.
Don?
Yep.
It's me.
I am.
I'm in Avalon. Listen, what are your plans after you? Are you sticking around in the area?
I have no plans, which is actually nice. Linda and we don't feel convicted about going anywhere yet. Linda has family, a fair amount of family up in Northeast,
Okay.
Philly, Langhorne, Ben Salem,
Yeah.
Bucks County. And we have a lot of friends in Montgomery. Linda's a Philly girl, so the friends that we vacation with, most of them live in Montgomery County. They're people that Linda worked with 40 years ago. We were at dinner last Friday night with somebody Linda went to kindergarten with. So we may ultimately downsize towards some of those folks, but we don't have any plans.
Okay, so you're staying put.
For the time being, and I'm going to follow my predecessor's good practice, and that is to disappear and get out of the hair of the next pastor to come. Bob did a great job with that. He worshiped in other congregations, Westminster, Wilmington, Bryn Mawr, and Wayne, I think were places Bob showed up to let me get my, feet on the ground here. I've already had some requests for weddings. Next October. And somebody said they wanted me to I'd come back and do their funeral if they didn't die while I was still here. And I said, I'm going to do what my predecessor did and say, I would love to do that, but can't. I need to let the next pastor get a foot in the door. And if you don't allow them to do that, they never make their way in. But we'll see. It's nice not to have any definite plans pressing us.
Good.
Plan, my shoulder should be good by then. I'm almost there now. And I plan to do a lot of fly fishing.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. Great to be with you.
Greg, can I do this?
Yeah.
Well, Dave's got a quick announcement or something.
Yes. When Craig and I were planning the speaker list this summer, Craig came up with this idea of having a train ride. So I put together a train trip on October 17th at 2 p.m. Whether it's good or not, there's no Eagles game that Sunday. It's a 90-minute ride along the beautiful Chester Creek Valley. We're starting in Westchester. We go to historic Glen Mills. We come back, and we have our own dining car. So you can bring your own food and drink. I'll be doing a historical analysis or a talk as we roll along, because there's lots of interesting sites, structures, and stories about people along the Westchester Railroad. So I think there's about 24 of you who have expressed an interest. Some of you have already paid, but if you'd like to go on the trip, it's $20, and you can see me and pay me, or Dave Goodale will keep sending out email announcements. And we'd like to see you all there because it's going to be a fun day. Hopefully the weather will be like today. So remember October 17th, the fellowship train trip.
Okay.